She was meant to die that morning, an Apache woman bound in chains beneath the desert sun, her fate sealed by hatred older than her name. But when the rancher looked into her eyes, he saw not an enemy, but a mirror of his own loneliness. In a land ruled by vengeance and bloodlines, mercy was a death sentence. Yet against the dust, the bullets, and the whispers of every man who called him a fool, he made a choice that would echo across the frontier. He took her hand, not her life. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Under the merciless blaze of the Arizona sun, the Apache woman knelt in the dust, wrists bound with rusted iron that had eaten soft cressets into her skin and left a map of old hurts. And around her a ring of ranch hands leaned on their saddles and laughed like a single animal, voices grinding out one cruel litany after another. Savage, murderer, not fit for decent men. And the sheriff, paper trembling slightly in his hand though his jaw was set, mouthed the charges that smelled more like rumor than law, accusations feathered by fear and folded into the ledger of frontier justice. From a distance, Samuel Dyer watched with a jaw that would not relax and a chest that remembered the weight of a wooden coffin. A man who had seen fields of men go still and come home with a hunger for nothing but quiet. A man who had married once and buried twice, his wife to fever, his small imagined family to the slow erasure of grief. And the sight of this bound woman brought him up short, as if he had ridden into a place that required him to make a choice he had spent years avoiding. He should have looked away. Every sensible muscle in a rancher's life tells you to look away when men sharpen their hate into law. But when their eyes met across the taut air, something in him moved, a small uncoiling like wind through dry grass. And in her dark caresses he saw not a wildness but a steadiness that mirrored a loneliness he had learned to keep hidden. She did not plead with clamoring words, did not scream for pity. Instead, her face was a quiet plain that held the memory of a different language, a different hearth, and the thin, unmistakable hard line of someone who had buried all her own and kept standing. Around them the crowd grew louder, and the boys who follow older men copied their laughter. And the sheriff cleared his throat to finish a ritual he'd performed before, another appointment with the rope, another sale of a life for the comfort of an angry morning. But Samuel felt the gun weigh like something he'd been given to balance the world, that instead of following the expected arc he walked forward and took it, not with the steady hand of a judge but the uncertain fingers of a man who had long ago learned a small arithmetic of mercy and ruin. "No," he said, and the sound came out less like command and more like a confession. The ripple that followed was immediate. Curses and bets and low men who called him soft and women who averted their eyes thinking of the safety of gossip and the safety of distance. He paid for her with a horse and with half a promise people counted in cattle. Words that made the sheriff's smirk deepen. And he cut the chains while men spat on the dirt and called the bargain foolish. But when the iron fell away, her wrists bled and the blood boiled the dust in. For the first time in that small circle of hatred, another man saw that the world could be otherwise. The woman rose slowly as if learning a body she had inhabiting anew, and when Samuel offered water she took it with fingers that trembled not from fear but from muscle unused to the gift of a stranger. She answered no questions, kept her voice like a low ember in a windstorm. And when she spoke in her soft clipped English, it carried the weight of names of people lost and villages burned, and a grief that did not beg for compassion so much as demand to be seen. In that hour the sun pressed down on all of them and shadow shortened to a single line. The men's verdict had been prepared. The town would have its stories that fed on division. But Samuel rode away with her beside him, and the ranch hands watched the pair until a bend in the trail swallowed them, whispering about mercy as if it were a contagious disease, unaware that the thing Samuel had done, an act that would brand him traitor to 1,000 quiet laws, was the first small rebellion against a frontier that had learned to call survival by other names. The sheriff pressed the revolver into Samuel's hand with the practiced indifference of a man who'd learned to make endings tidy. The cold barrel a small, heavy argument for the town's appetite, and for a breath Samuel felt the old reflex, shoulder straight, eyes steady, the posture of a man who knows how to close a story. But something inside him had shifted, a smaller defeat that had learned the shape of mercy in the dark hours when grief sat with him and would not leave. "Finish it," the sheriff said, and the crowd leaned forward like vultures into a light that had no forgiveness. And for a heartbeat the world reduced itself to a single calculation. Pulled a hammer. quiet the rumor, feed the myth that keeps men from fearing their neighbors. But the muzzle trembled in his hand, and the word that left his mouth was not law or bravado, but a simple, dry refusal, no, and it fell over the assembled anger like a stubborn stone in a river, throwing up ripples. The laughter turned sour. Men spat words that had been warmed on the tongues of other men for years, names and curses that were meant to make the act inevitable. But Samuel handed the gun back because his chest had been hollowed by losses that taught him how fragile life felt beneath the ordinary. He'd watched fever take smiles from a house, had tied linen around a tiny grave in a wind that only made the emptiness louder, and the sight of the Apache woman, shoulders square though wrists raw, had pressed a new and dangerous fact against his rib. She was not the shape the rumor had cut for her. A bargain followed like a bad poem, half his cattle, a horse that had rarely left the corral, coin and trade that in town meant something more binding than law, and the sheriff's smirk said plainly what everyone already knew. Mercy is a weakness, a disease that spreads, and a man who pays for another's breath will pay in reputation and in sleep. They called it buying a debt. Samuel called it buying a chance for a different kind of accounting. And when the sheriff snapped the chains at his blade, the metal had a finality that tasted of rust and of a world that meant to reduce people to property. But when the shackles clattered free, the woman rose like a slow-lidded oath, wrists marked and bleeding, and yet bearing a dignity the crowd could not translate. She did not weep or rage. Her silence was a kind of language that Samuel had time enough to learn if he wished. Around the men traded wagers about how long his softness would last, what price would be exacted from a man who had chosen to step outside the small, cruel arithmetic of frontier life. Wives would whisper behind window curtains, the preacher would tidy his sentences to avoid scandal, and the herd of whispered threats would circle the ranch like wolves testing a fence. Samuel led her away not as a captive but as an arrangement had it been a different world, guiding her by a rope he meant to loosen when the dust settled, while the town's contempt pressed like a burr in his back. In the wagons and around the saloon tables they told themselves tales that made his action into spectacle. He lost his mind, traded cattle for a curiosity, invited ruin. He heard it all and it stuck to the skin of his days. But the moments after the chains fell were quieter and stranger. He offered water with hands that still smelled of gun smoke and tar. She accepted with fingers that trembled from the rawness and from a muscle memory of war and loss. And when she answered in clipped, measured English, it carried the weight of names and villages and burned-out huts. Her words were not pleas but statements, a ledger of what she had seen and what she had survived. Samuel did not yet know the storms that mercies conjure, jealousy, revenge, the slow accumulation of small cruelties, but as he rode her back toward the ranch, the sun a hard coin in the sky, he felt the old maps of his life ripped at the edges, and though the town would call him traitor and cowards would talk of justice, somewhere inside him a decision unfurled that would make enemies and children in equal measure. He had bought her life with livestock and stubbornness, and in doing so had brought a foreign, dangerous thing to his door, hope, and everything that grows from it. They rode back under a sky so wide it felt like a removed verdict, the trail a single gray vein through scrub and stone, and the Apache woman sat beside Samuel like a stubborn memory that resisted being smoothed away. Her wrist carried the red moons of iron and fresh skin, cords of muscle tightened from work and pain, and though her face held no pleading, it was not empty. There was a patience there forged by loss and ash, an evenness that made Samuel feel both ashamed and oddly seen, as if the truth of his own hollows were reflected in the hard calm of her gaze. Around them the land kept its indifferent counsel, lizards skittered between rocks, a lone hawk folded and refolded its wings, and in the distance the thin chorus of coyotes stitched the edges of daylight to the coming night. The ranch hands thought the moment belonged to gossip and wagers, that mercy would look like a mistake from the saddle. They called across the dust, their voices loose as knotted rope, but the sound fell short and counted for less than the steady creak of leather. Samuel sat with the weight of what he had done settling into his bones like winter coming early. An odd commerce had been struck at the sheriff's table, cattle and a horse traded for a life, and he could already hear the ledger of the town balancing itself in whispers. But beside him the woman kept to her own rhythm, guiding the mare with the same quiet authority she used to hold her own grief. When he offered water she delayed, turning the tin cup in her hands as if weighing the propriety of accepting kindness from the man who had bought her breath. At last she took it, lips brushing the rim with fingers that left faint marks on the metal, and her refusal before that moment was not rudeness but a small, private ceremony. No debt would be bought with gratitude, no favor paid with performance, and Samuel understood, painfully, that gestures here were currency and that to accept a gift was to be bound in a way the sheriff's chains had only pretended to be. Night found them by a low fire that smelled of sage and old tobacco, the rancher's lantern giving the woman's profile the kind of soft relief that makes a stranger's face memorable. She peeled at the scab on her wrist with a tenderness that was almost sacred, and, when the wind moved and the scent of smoke carried, she spoke to it in a language Samuel did not know. The words small stones dropped into a river that did not need to answer. The sound of her voice in that unknown tongue was a filament of sorrow and stubbornness woven together, an invocation maybe, or simply a private accounting. And Samuel listened like a man who had been taught to eavesdrop on his own conscience. Her whispers seemed to comb through the day's sharp edges, naming ghosts, naming fire, naming what the settlers could not see, people, places, the slow geometry of loss. He thought of his wife, the quiet house where laughter had once been practiced like prayer, how fever had taken it away and left him with rooms that learned to echo. He thought of the way he had hardened himself afterward, how he had turned grief into tidy business and cattle ledgers, and sitting there watching her lips move in a tongue older than his grudges, he felt a fissure open where tenderness might seep in. They did not speak much. Dialogue here was a scarce and precious thing, but when the woman finally used English it was clipped and deliberate, not a surrender to the men who had named her savage, but a careful placing of identity like a stone on a cairn. She said where she had been, in fragments, referencing burned fields and a brother's name that tasted of loss, and the confession landed on Samuel as if he had been waiting for it, though he had not known to expect sorrow in that precise shape. The night tightened like a shawl, stars pricking through, and the firelight cut their faces into small islands. Samuel kept watch because it felt like the least honorable thing to do, to offer a measure of protection when he had the means to do nothing. And the woman, though she drifted toward sleep with the practiced lightness of someone who had learned to sleep with one ear open, kept murmuring to the wind as if sealing promises to those she had left behind. In the silence between their breaths the land held its own verdict, and Samuel understood that mercy here was no simple absolution but a summons to reckon. He had bought her life, yes, but in buying it he had invited a storm that could take his name and the quiet of his nights. Still he felt, beneath the old, dutiful shame, a strange relief, as if for the first time since the fever took his household he had offered something without calculation. And the sound of her speech in the dark, grief braided with defiance, would haunt him like a truth until he either made good on it or was destroyed trying. Inside the low rooms of Samuel Dyer's ranch the past crowded the corners like dust motes, the picture above the hearth, a woman who had once laughed like weather, holding the center of the wall as if her photograph alone could keep the house honest. And mornings began with a small ritual of sunlight finding the dust that settled on that smile. Samuel moved through the rooms with the practiced gentleness of a man who had learned how to live around absence. Kettles warmed as if to keep an old routine, the saddle polished though he no longer rode with the bright foolishness of youth, and every sound drew a measure against memories. The creak of a floorboard where little feet might have landed, the slow clock that marked out hours like stitches in a wound. When the Yelly came to the ranch she did not enter those rooms. No one in town expected a man who had paid for another's life with livestock to also break bread with her. And so she was given a corner in the barn where hay smelled of summer and animals trusted nothing but the present. Samuel watched her at first from the threshold as if looking at a painting he should not touch, seeing her move among the animals with a care that was not sentimental but precise, a woman at ease with hands that knew how to mend more than fences. The ranch hands talked, which is how towns keep their stories tidy. They said Samuel had gone soft, that grief should be suffocated and not stirred, that a man who let a stranger into his field of view would invite wolves. Their jokes had the wear of old tools, sharp enough to hurt and blunt enough to be commonplace. And when they brought their laughter to the saloon they measured his mercy in drinks and bets, circling a narrative where kindness equaled foolishness and loyalty to the herd mattered more than any private conscience. Samuel heard the words and felt them like nettles on his skin. But what stirred inside him was stranger than shame. Sometimes it rose as guilt, because in the evenings he would sit where his wife's chair had been and imagine her smoothing the hem of a dress he could never wash clean of memory, and the sight of Niyeli in the barn, shoulders set like a bow, made his own cowardice show as plainly as a scar. Other times what moved was the thin, dangerous thing called hope, a number that had the habit of appearing when the world seemed most finished, small, ridiculous, bright, and it tugged at him like wind through a chink in a cabin wall. He found himself watching how the light fell on Nayeli's hands when she braided rope, or how she fed the colts without fuss, and these ordinary acts kept a conversation alive in the house that words had not yet dared to begin. At night, when the wind came down from the ridge and rattled the shutters, Samuel would stand with his palms against the worn banister and think of his wife's voice folded into the hush of that house. Sometimes he thought he heard it, whether memory or wish he could not tell, but more often it was Nayeli's soft humming from the barn, a tune that did not belong to his country but fit the shape of a lullaby all the same, and the sound braided uneasily with his recollection, making a new harmony that felt like an impertinence and a blessing at once. The preacher's wife crossed herself when she saw Nayeli working by the trough. The neighbors rotated their glances like lanterns toward Samuel, watching to see whether he would be shamed or rescued by some hidden law. And yet, in the small economies of the ranch, life rearranged itself. A kettle warmed for an extra pot, a second plate quietly set when the men were done in the fields, a blanket left by the barn door on colder nights. Samuel would not speak of marriage or vows, not yet. Words had weight and could topple the fragile arrangements they were building. But in the hush between Charles and twilight, he felt the invisible thread of responsibility grow taut, binding his days to a woman he had bought with cattle and stubbornness and who had returned his purchase with labor, not servitude. Guilt kept him honest. He remembered the sheriff's smirk and the men's bets, but it was undercut by a deeper reckoning. He had chosen this because he could no longer live entirely by the ledger of town approval, and in giving her a place, even in the barn, he had opened a doorway that might one day let in forgiveness or ruin. Either way, the house would no longer be simply a memorial to loss but the site of a slow, dangerous revival, and Samuel held both possibilities like Cole's colt in both hands, knowing that every kind thing he did would be counted as sin by some and his salvation by others, while the ghost of his wife watched from her frame with a smile dusted by time, neither condemning nor blessing but simply witnessing the strange, human work of two people learning how to live together under a sky that kept its own counsel. News travels on hoot and gossip, and the town learned Samuel Dyer had done something unforgivable long before he rode into the main street the next morning. Men spat as he passed, an old, public ritual meant to mark a body's disgrace, and the sound struck him like gravel in a boot, small sharp wits that collected without mercy. For in a place where law and rumor braid themselves into custom, the smallest transgression blooms into legend overnight. At the storefronts, women paused with cloths in their hands, fingers tightening around hems as if the fabric might stitch their own courage back together. The preacher's wife crossed to the far side of the street, her back straight as if aligning herself to a different moral compass, and children tugged at sleeves to watch how a man dared to live when the ledger of the town had decided he owed more than he could pay. The saloon's door swung as it always did, wide and indifferent, and inside the conversation had a new rhythm. "Traitor," someone muttered through a chew of tobacco, and then the single word was flung like a stone that found purchase in more mouths than one. Samuel took his saddle off in the corner and sat with his shoulders like stone while the room's noise folded around him. And though he could have walked into the sunlight and let their tongues have him, he stayed because the choice he had made was not a thing he could show off like a trophy but a slow, stubborn experiment in living differently. He drank alone until the whiskey warmed the inside of him enough to blot out the fresh sting of insult. And when he left the saloon, the town's looks followed him home like a train of small, accusing shadows. Around the ranch hands, the talk sharpened into threat. They muttered in lean groups that a line had been crossed and that nature of the frontier required corrections. "Finish what he wouldn't," one said, voice like gravel, and the words were not idle because lawlessness here was a kind of weather, and men who smelled blood or weakness thought it their duty to act. The town's meetings, informal and quick over fence lines and at the feed store, morphed into council. Older men recalled names and feuds and the things their fathers had done to keep a proper order, and their stories pressed on younger men until those younger men could not tell what they believed and what they had been taught to believe. The preacher tightened his sermons. His eyes slid past Samuel as if pity might be contagious. Samuel's neighbors no longer borrowed tools without a ledger. They measured him in glances that sought out the moment the bargain had been struck. How much had he paid, and how much had he cost himself? And in those counts he could feel the town's slow accounting against his soul. The sheriff, who had earlier smirked over the sale, kept a polite distance now, as a man who had placed a bet knows how to avoid looking at losing cards. In the afternoons, the children, too young to know law but old enough for mimicry, would call to one another in the alleys, mimicking the language they heard their fathers use: savage, bought, soft, words that should have been taught in classrooms but instead were passed like talismans in the marketplace. The Yali stayed at the barn and felt the town's gaze like insects on skin. She learned to move in its shadow, to do her work without drawing attention. But attention found the head of the ranch no matter where he put it. A wagon wheel creaked suspiciously at the gate. A note was left under the door with a smear of ink and a threat made of crooked syntax. And at night there were the sounds of horses that did not belong to the ranch cutting the dark along the ridge. Samuel did not answer with loud words. Retaliation in the form of bravado would make the town's story easier to swallow. Instead, he moved through his days with a stubborn silence, repairing fences, tending fields, feeding horses, waiting to see whether the small, cruel law of the frontier would come for him in force or whether his neighbors would be satisfied with the chatter of their indignation. Yet the whispering had its own teeth. Hired help grew nervous. Men who would have worked without question hesitated at long jobs and left earlier than they used to. Commerce has the soft logic of fear, and so even the visiting merchants crossed their own thresholds with quieter voices. In the barn, the Yali heard the same talk in the paws of boots and the clink of metal. Sometimes she would open the loft door and see faces lean in shadows, mouths shaping rumors like prayers, and her silence in their presence was louder than any retort. Still, beneath the clamor, Samuel found a stubborn center, an odd ballast of conviction that did not need the town's blessing to exist, because he had, in his own quiet way, done something that answered to a deeper reckoning than popular opinion could hold. And whether the frontier punished him or learned from him would be decided in a future that no one could yet name. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Dawn found the ranch wrapped in a thin blue hush that smelled of cold and old dust, and Samuel's first steps outside met a sight that shoved sleep from his chest. The yearling lay gutted by the fence, entrails splayed like a crude map, blood dark and tacky against the post where foot and hoof had marked the place. He had expected whispers and spitting, the perish of small humiliations, but this was a language meant to be read at once, a warning carved into flesh. Men had always measured one another by cattle and courage, and someone had chosen to speak in a ledger of violence. The Yali stood a little way off, a silhouette against the ridge, the morning wind licking at her hair, and in her hand, half hidden by the sleeve of a borrowed coat, was the sharpened tip of a spear she had wedged into the ground like a stake. When she saw Samuel's face, it was not fear that moved across her features, but the hard, patient calculation of someone who had counted losses and found them wanting. "They'll come," she murmured, English broken by the weight of another tongue but exact in its warning, and her voice was a small blade in the wide air. Samuel felt the truth of it like a chill walking under his shirt. This was not the whisper of cowardly men, but the first knock of those who would test the limits of mercy. The fence line, which had been a boundary of pasture and neighborly exchange, had been turned into a message board where grudges hung alongside slaughter, and the simple geometry of that act made it clear. Either he would yield to rumor or he would make a stand that could fracture everything he had left. He moved methodically, because method is the thing that steadies a man when rage and dread tremble at the edge of thought. He examined the animal for tracks, for the direction of boots, for the crude signature of a man who wanted to be known without revealing himself, and found prints that matched the kind of men who learned their sentences at the saloon rather than in a court. The hoof prints of a stranger were plain, too, indicating they had not taken their work from the night entirely quiet but had expected dawn as a cloak. Neely watched him not as one waiting for orders, but as one who understood the landscape of consequence. When he returned her gaze, she lifted the spearhead as if to remind him she could be both the warning and the defense. He listened to the barn. No ordinary cattle calls, only the low, uneasy shifts of animals and the creak of a gate that now felt like a hinge between peace and reprisal, and felt the press of 1,000 little judgments that the town would throw onto him like a net if he did not choose carefully. He knew, with the tacit knowledge that only a man who keeps livestock accrues, that someone intended this to hurt him where a man is most vulnerable, his livelihood, and that it was both personal and public, a message meant to erode any other man's appetite for mercy. There was no grand speech to make. The frontier did not reward sermons, only choices. Samuel loaded his rifle with the same slow hands that had once dressed a wound and buried a wife, the motion both ritual and prayer, and positioned himself on the ridge to watch the hills as if he might will the future by concentration alone. He felt the old ledger open inside him, debts and credits, the arithmetic of who owed what to whom, and realized that by buying her life he had shifted their columns. Now someone sought to balance the books with blood. The morning expanded and contracted like a bellows. Ravens argued over the carcass in hoarse voices while Nayeli paced the fence with the spear's shadow behind her, and Samuel, rifle rested across his knees, found that the clean, small certainty of duty had mutated into something messier: protection, reputation, and a stubborn thing he did not yet name. Men in town would speak of this day as proof of him, either weakness or courage, depending on what served their stories. But standing there with the gutted animal at his feet and the woman who had cost him cattle at his side, Samuel understood that mercy had a price and that the frontier would test whether he would pay with his life or with a new kind of stubbornness. And so he watched the hills and listened for hoofbeats and the shuffle of deliberate boots, knowing the storm would arrive when it willed, and preparing in the only way that suited him, with steady hands, a loaded rifle, and a resolve born of both grief and the small, dangerous hope that maybe, against the arithmetic of lawless men, something like honor could hold. Days folded into one another like rough-stitched quilts, each dawn an accounting of small mercies and chores, and the Yelly moved through the ranch with a silent authority that felt less like servitude and more like a right, hauling water in the leather pail until the cords had molded to the shape of her hands, mending a torn saddle with fingers that knew knots in human anatomy the way some people know scripture, laying fresh hay for the mares and whispering to animals that listen the way the living do when they are tired of being explained away. Samuel watched her from the doorway of the house and from the ridge where he checked fences, and every quiet motion she made told him more about who she had been than the sheriff's ledger or the saloon talk ever could. Strength that did not shout, dignity that refused spectacle, an economy of action that refused pity. There were no long speeches between them, no declarations that would make good copy for the men who liked sharpened stories. Instead, they traded glances that did the work of paragraphs, a look over a shoulder that said stay, a tilt of the head that asked permission to pass, a curtain at noon when the sun made promises in heat. The ranch hands noticed and misread and then returned to their habits of tidy cruelty. But Samuel found the quiet teaching him a different grammar, the subtle ways to meet a person's labor with respect, the small courtesies that do the legal work of binding a household together. She surprised him with the simplicity of her competence, how she soothed a colt that had been startled by thunder, how she could find the soft patch under a mule's flank where a saddle rubbed raw, how she moved through the barn in winter with a steady breath that warmed the air like coal. He began to time his returns to the house to intersect with tasks she was finishing, not because he wanted to show patronage but because the sound of her work had become part of the household's pulse. A kettle would hiss and he would hear her at the trough, and the ordinary choreography of life, meals, mending, the exchange of tools, folded around her presence until it felt natural as wind. One evening the sky gathered its old threats, distant thunder that sounded like a train running through the bones of the earth, and rain came as if the heavens could not spare them a single drop. The men hurried with tarps and ropes, the horses fidgeted and stamped, and when Samuel stepped outside he saw Nayeli standing in the open like a figure from another weather, arms raised and face tipped into the dark, the rain baptizing the lines of her cheeks and hair. For a long second he thought the wind had stolen the words from him, and then he walked toward her and said, voice small in the drum of the storm, "You honor the dead." She did not turn as if startled. Instead she lowered her arms slightly and her English, patient and trimmed by loss, answered with the same unadorned weight. Always, the exchange was no oath nor contract, no symbolic entanglement of vows. It was the first honest language between them, small and precise, like placing two stones together and discovering they fit. In that instant Samuel felt the house's past, his late wife's framed smile above the hearth, the kitchen table where laughter had once been practiced, bent toward a present that was not empty. The rain blurred the edges of memory and made new moorings possible. They did not speak around it afterward. Words would have been clumsy, and both had learned the cost of careless speech. Instead, their unspoken pact settled into actions. She continued her work without pleading for affection. He began leaving extra bread by the barn door and mending tools he had once thought trivial, and the rhythm of the ranch grew patient and kind on days when patience was a dangerous commodity. Around them the town's whispering became a background hum, something to be acknowledged but not obeyed, and the small daily courtesies between a man and a woman who had arrived at each other by way of scandal hardened into a scaffolding of mutual care. There were nights Samuel woke to find her already at the trough, silhouette bent against lantern light, and nights when she would catch him watching and lift a hand in a simple gesture that held both warning and invitation. The pack they carried was unglorified and utterly brave, to keep one another visible in a place that preferred to name people by rumor, to bind wounds with labor instead of legend, to honor ghosts without letting them rule the living. In the slow passing of seasons that followed, their quiet sowing and the simple reaping, this unspoken agreement would prove the plow that turned hard soil towards something like a life. And beneath the watching sky Samuel felt, for the first time since his wife's fever, the hollow in his chest refilled with something that might be called hope. The night came with a bitter wind, the kind that pulled through the cracks of the ranch house like a ghost too stubborn to stay buried, and Samuel built the fire higher than usual, not for warmth but for the company of its light, the kind that turns loneliness into a companion rather than an enemy. Across from him, the Yali sat cross-legged, her hands resting on her knees, her face shaped by the steady rhythm of flame, and for a long while neither spoke, because silence had become their most fluent language. Outside, the world was locked in stillness, horses shifting in the corral, the faint creak of a shutter, the desert itself holding its breath. Samuel stared at the fire until it blurred into memory, his wife's laughter caught in sunlight, the promise of a child that had never seen dawn, and the words rose before he could stop them. "Fever took her," he said, voice low, the sentence shaped like confession. "Her and the child both. Doctor couldn't ride fast enough, and he stopped, not because he didn't remember but because memory was too sharp, and even years later it drew blood." The Yali didn't interrupt, she simply leaned closer, the fire painting her face in shades of copper and shadow. Samuel continued, softer now. "House was quiet for a long time after that. You start thinking the silence is a kind of punishment. Then one day it just feels like home." He expected pity, the polite sort people keep for graves, but what he found in her eyes was something steadier, recognition, not comfort. When she finally spoke, her English stumbled on the edges of grief, but the story it carried was clear enough to cut through any language. "My village," she began, voice trembling like a reed but hardening with each word. "Men came with fire. Soldiers. They said we took horses, killed white men near the river. We did not. We had only old rifles. My brother, he was 14. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. He died standing. I saw him fall. The man who shot him wore a blue coat, like yours." Samuel's head lifted at that. Shame washing over him so fast had made his hands shake. He had worn that coat once, served under its banner, believed it stood for order in a wild land. He wanted to tell her he had never been part of that particular raid, but the difference felt hollow. Men like him had been there, wearing his same uniform, carrying his same prayers about justice while committing the same sins. The fire crackled, throwing up sparks that seemed to burn in rhythm with the silence that followed, a silence that was not empty but full, of ghosts, of reckoning, of two worlds finally admitting their pain in the same breath. Yeli's eyes softened, not in forgiveness perhaps, but in the weary understanding of one who has learned that suffering is not a race to be won. It is a road shared by the broken. "You did not kill him," she said finally, voice low but unwavering. "But you wore the coat. You understand." Samuel nodded, feeling something twist in his chest, an ache deeper than guilt, an ache for what could never be undone. "I do," he said, and the words tasted of ash. The fire between them flickered, throwing light on faces that mirrored one another's grief from opposite ends of history. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, and the first drops hissed against the coals like whispered blessings. For a moment, neither spoke, and in that hush something shifted, a fragile, impossible bridge built not of apology but of endurance. The Yali reached forward, stirred the fire with a stick, and said, "The dead, they stay when we speak them. Tonight, they are here." Samuel looked into the flames and saw not just his wife and child but her brother, her village, all the unburied names of the frontier's cruelty, and somehow the weight of remembering them together made it bearable. The silence that followed was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close, a recognition that sorrow shared does not divide but joins, a covenant born not of love but of truth, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be believed. When the wind finally died and the fire sank low, Samuel felt the smallest seed of peace day crude in the ash, fragile but real, and he understood that from this night forward, their stories, no matter how scarred, would burn together. The night they came back, the air was wrong before the sound arrived, a strange, heavy stillness that sat over the ranch like a held breath, the kind that animals sense long before men admit it. The horses were restless in their pens, their hoofs striking the earth in nervous rhythm, and even the wind seemed to pause behind the hills, carrying the scent of something old and cruel. Samuel had been sitting by the hearth, the rifle leaning nearby, or the lamp throwing its small circle of light on a half-mended harness, when the first glimmer of torches broke the horizon. He rose without a word. The memory of burned fences and gutted cattle had taught him that light at night seldom brought comfort. Outside, a dozen men rode up slow, their horses snorting steam, the torches painting their faces in the uneasy orange of Hal's rehearsal. The sheriff wasn't among them this time, only familiar faces from the saloon, neighbors who once tipped their hats in the daylight but now looked like something feral wearing human shapes. "Evening, Dyer," one called, his voice slurred by drink and hatred. "We come for what you owe the valley. You give her up, and maybe your barn don't burn next." The others murmured their agreement, the firelight catching in their eyes like tiny vortices. Samuel stepped forward, the rifle steady in his hands, its barrel dark against the glow. "You'll have to go through me," he said quietly, and the sound of his voice was neither loud nor pleading. It carried the weight of a man who had already buried the worst parts of himself. Laughter cracked through the group like drywood breaking, ugly and forced. "Don't make yourself a martyr, Sam," another said, spit glistening as he spoke. "Ain't no one worth dying for, especially not one of them." Samuel didn't flinch. He could feel Miele somewhere behind him in the dark, the faint rhythm of her breath where shadow met the barn door. He thought of her silence, her work, the way she lifted her eyes to the rain as if it might cleanse what the world had done to her, and he felt a pulse of defiance, not righteous but necessary. "You boys think you know what's right," he said, voice tightening. "You just don't know what's left of yourselves." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a man at the edge spat, cursed, and raised his torch higher, the flame shivering in the wind. But even drunken courage has its limits, and Samuel's rifle, pointed squarely and without tremor, made the truth visible. "Ain't worth blood," one muttered, tugging his reins, and one by one the others followed, some sneering, some muttering, all unwilling to be the first fool to test how far Samuel's mercy could bend before it broke. The torches retreated down the slope, their light shrinking into fireflies, leaving behind only the bitter smell of smoke and horse sweat. Samuel stayed still long after they were gone, the rifle still lifted, the silence stretching wide enough to hold his exhaustion. Then he lowered it slowly, the steel still warm under his palm. Behind him, the barn door creaked, and Noelle stepped into the faint lamplight, her face unreadable but her eyes fierce with knowing. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. The language of the frontier had never needed many words to name the truth. Violence, once called, never leaves quietly. She crossed her arms, watching the road where the men had vanished, and said at last, her English jagged but sure, "They will come again." Samuel nodded, his mouth a hard line. "I know." The night breathed again, the crickets starting their chorus as if unaware of the ugliness that had passed. In the dark above, the stars looked sharp enough to cut, but their beauty offered no comfort. The world, he realized, did not punish cruelty, it only delayed its return. Niele turned back toward the barn, her silhouette folding into the shadows like something half-spirit, half-woman, while Samuel stood alone by the fence, staring at the hills where the torchlight had gone out, knowing that mercy had made him a marked man and that the next knock would not be satisfied with words. He watched the darkness until it moved again, not from fear but from certainty, and when he finally went inside, the rifle came with him, a grim promise cradled in tired hands. The dawn broke red and wrong, the kind of color that belongs to endings, and Samuel woke not to birds or the quiet hum of morning but to the stench of burning hay and the terrible sound of horses screaming, long, human cries that ripped the distance between life and pain. Smoke clawed its way through the window before he even reached the door, and when he stumbled outside, boots half-laced, the barn was already half-eaten by flame, a roaring creature with 1,000 hungry mouths. Sparks leapt like startled souls into the pale sky, and the wind, always indifferent, dragged the fire through the dry grass with the casual cruelty of nature lending its hand to man's hate. He knew in an instant it wasn't accident. Fire never starts itself on calm nights, and in the thin drift of footprints near the fence, half erased by wind, Samuel saw proof of what hatred does when it runs out of words. But there was no time for vengeance or logic. The heat drove at him like a wall, and the horses inside were thrashing, trapped by the warped door that had jammed when the beams fell. The yeller, he shouted, his voice cracked and swallowed by smoke, and before he could reach the barn's threshold, she was already there, darting through the haze like some creature of light and dust, her skirts snapping in the heat, her hair wild and catching embers like stars. He swore, tried to follow, but the wave of heat forced him back. Through the smoke he saw her, small, defiant, every muscle a prayer, and she was cutting ropes with a pitchfork handle, striking at stalls to free the terrified animals, their black shapes surging out of the inferno. A horse burst through the door with its mane ablaze, nearly knocking her off her feet, but she kept moving, her face streaked with soot, her voice low and steady in a language the flames seemed to obey. Samuel grabbed a wet blanket, wrapped it around himself, and plunged after her, the smoke thick enough to blind him to everything but sound, the crack of timbers, her cough, the terrified snorts of the animals escaping. He found her at the last stall, struggling with a rope fused by fire, and when it finally snapped, the door behind them gave way, raining sparks and ash. He caught her by the arm and dragged her out, both of them falling hard into the dirt as the barn roof folded in on itself with a groan that sounded almost alive. The blast of heat threw them apart, and Samuel crawled toward her, lungs burning, throat raw, pulling her into the cold sand where they gasped like fish thrown ashore. Her hair was singed at the ends, her hands raw and blackened, her eyes shining not with tears but with a strange, stubborn light of someone who has faced death so many times it no longer feels foreign. Samuel coughed, voice shredded. "Why would you risk it?" He rasped, the words breaking into the air like accusation, though behind them was fear, the raw, useless terror of a man who has almost lost the one thing keeping him tethered to decency. Nieli turned her head toward him, the fire reflected in her eyes, her voice quiet but unflinching. "Because they are not yours or mine," she said slowly, each word shaped by breath and pain. "They are alive." Her voice carried no sermon, no pride, just fact, as simple and unbending as the land itself. The words cut through him deeper than any wound fire could leave, searing into the part of him that had once divided the world into property, into ownership and cost. He looked at the blaze devouring the barn, felt the heat against his skin, and for the first time in years, something inside him broke open, not with despair but with the unbearable truth of her conviction. Around them, the freed horses circled the edge of the pasture, eyes wide and white, steam rising from their bodies as dawn bled into the smoke-filled sky. The barn collapsed in on itself, a final sigh of embers, and the silence that followed was almost holy, the sound of ruin and survival braided together. Samuel reached out, resting a trembling hand over hers, and for a long moment they sat amid the ashes, two figures marked by fire but somehow untouched by its intent, their breaths sinking in the thin dawn air. What had burned was only wood and memory, but what remained, mercy, courage, the fierce insistence of life, was something no hatred could ever set alight. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The morning after the fire, the air still carried the taste of ash and the quiet of something ended, and Samuel stood among the blackened ribs of what used to be his barn, boots sinking into the soft ruin where the earth had drunk smoke all night. The horses grazed uneasily nearby, their hides streaked with soot but their bodies alive, a testament to a mercy he hadn't earned but had witnessed. The ranch, once his measure of order and survival, looked small now, humbled by flame, and as he watched Nieli walk the perimeter, her movements deliberate, gathering what little was left, a scorched bridle, a bucket, half a charred beam she tested for strength, he realized she was still working, not for him, not even for herself, but for something invisible that outlasted ownership. When she came back toward him, her face was streaked with ash and exhaustion, yet her eyes were steady, unbroken, as if the fire had burned away everything except truth. Samuel drew a breath that felt too heavy for his chest and said the words he had been holding since dawn. "You don't owe me anything. No chains, no debts. You're free to go." The words left him hollow. They were the right thing, and yet they hurt in a way that right things often do when they threaten to take meaning with them. She stopped, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her sweat-streaked hands, and studied him as though testing whether his offer was another kind of burden. "If I leave," she said finally, her voice low but sharp with conviction, "they win." Her gaze did not flinch. The simplicity of her statement carried more weight than argument. No grand speeches about justice, no appeal to gratitude. Just defiance, carved clean. Samuel felt a flicker in his chest, something like shame and pride braided together, because he knew exactly who they were, the men in town who spat his name, the ghosts of soldiers in blue coats, the faceless hunger of the frontier that demanded submission as proof of belonging. "It isn't safe here," he said, quieter now, almost pleading. But even as he spoke the words, he knew she had already decided. "Safe," she echoed, and the words sounded foreign, even absurd, on her tongue. "You think there is safe for people like me?" Then she turned from him and began walking toward the remnants of the bar. For a long time he watched her gather her things, her small woven bag, a scrap of cloth she used as a shawl, a wooden comb that had somehow survived the fire, and without ceremony or hesitation, she carried them not toward the fields or the open road but toward the house. Samuel followed her, not to stop her but because he needed to understand the shape of what was happening. She paused at the porch, the blackened horizon behind her like a curtain closing on one chapter and opening another, and when she stepped inside the house, it was as if a threshold invisible to both of them had been crossed. The house had been his wife's once. The air still carried faint traces of lavender and ghostly warmth, and as Nieli moved through the narrow space, setting her few belongings in the corner near the hearth, the room seemed to exhale. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't offer it. Instead, he simply watched as she arranged her shawl beside his wife's old picture on the mantel, the two fabrics, one pale, one dark, catching the same light, their edges nearly touching. When she finally sat, her hands folded in her lap, the silence between them shifted, not the brutal quiet of strangers forced into proximity, but something gentler, something beginning. The firelight from the new hearth flickered against the walls, and the smoke curled upward like a prayer neither of them would claim. Samuel stood by the window, watching the dusk settle over the charred barn, and said softly, "You don't have to prove anything to me." Neely looked up at him, her expression calm but unreadable, and replied, "I don't stay for you." He nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth almost, but not quite, lifting. "I know." And in that acknowledgement lay a fragile peace, an understanding built from ashes and the thin threads of mutual endurance. Outside, the wind shifted through the valley, carrying away the last scent of smoke, and inside, for the first time in years, Samuel did not feel haunted, only human, standing in the quiet beside a woman who had chosen, against every cruelty of the world, to stay. Moonlight carved the ranch into silver and shadow, and the night that came for them wore the same faces as before but with a colder intent. Samuel heard hoofbeats like a hand across the skin of the world before he saw the torches, and then the men spilled over the ridge with their mouths full of courage and malice, a dozen shapes that moved like a single bad thought, and Samuel, who had spent years measuring danger by the weight of a rifle across his knees, felt the old ledger of consequence tilt toward a reckoning. He stepped out onto the porch with the rifle already warm in his palms, the scent of smoke and ash still clinging to his coat, and the men called to him, voices low and greasy with the certainty of their law, "Give her up, or we'll drag her from your house." There was no sheriff this time, only the raw calculus of men who thought the frontier answered to its own hunger, and Samuel's answer was a steady, quiet thing, "Not tonight." The first shots cracked like brittle twigs and the world shrank to the sound of splintering timber in the high, terrified whinny of a horse somewhere behind the barn. He felt the bite of one bullet before he saw the bloom of red along his shoulder, a hot, stupid bloom that made the breath leave him with the sound halfway between a curse and a prayer. Pain hit the world with the intimate specificity of a hand pressing on a fresh bruise, and for a moment he could do nothing but stand and taste iron. The Yali moved faster than the men had expected, faster than Samuel had allowed himself to imagine, and there was an economy to her motion that turned the night into a litany. She grabbed for his rifle as if it were a necessary tool and not an emblem, swung the stock to her shoulder, and began to fire with a calm that betrayed no panic, each shot measured as if she counted not rounds but reasons. The men, who had come with torches and promises, staggered under the sudden precision of her aim. Two fell like broken trees, their bodies folding into the dust, and the rest, seeing their number diminish and their resolve harden into a ragged thing, turned and fled into the dark, hooves and curses receding until the valley swallowed them whole. When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed had the taste of a held breath after a long cry, and Samuel, bleeding and trembling, stared at Nieli with a disorientation that bordered on worship. She stood with the rifle steadied against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel like a hem, and her face was clean and savage at once, stood in moonlight making her features look carved from the night itself. He wanted to speak, to offer some gratitude that would be large enough to cover the cost, but his mouth found only shallow, ragged sounds. His hand went to his shoulder and came away in a smear of warmth, and for the first time since he'd paid for her with horseflesh and stubbornness he knew, as clearly as a bell, that he had been saved by the very person the town would have damned him for sheltering. "You could have left," he finally managed, voice thin as thread. She did not answer with platitudes. She dropped the rifle and came to him, her hands working with the practiced certainty of someone who has wrestled with worse, and when she touched his shoulder it was not with pity but with a kind of appraisal that steadied him more than any salve. "You kept your hands from killing me," she said, voice steady though the moonlight made the words sound raw, "so I keep mine for you." The honesty of it struck him like a fresh wind. Around them the ranch breathed, horses lowing, a dog whining in the distance, the faint click of a shutter settling, and the bodies of the two men lay silent testaments to a choice that had been made in the dark. Mercy had been met with violence, and violence had been answered with an act that neither law nor rumor could quite translate. Samuel felt guilt and awe themselves in his chest. He had expected hatred to be the end, the thing that would close around them and choke out any softer shouts, but Nieli's firing hand had pushed back the dark and left him with an impossible dead. She had saved the life of a man who wore the uniform his brother Shooter wore. She had chosen to stand between him and the valley's appetite for blood, and in doing so she had rewritten for a night at least the rules they all had learned by inheritance. He tried to stand, faltering, and she caught him as if she had been practicing such holds for herself as well as for animals, and the proximity of her warmth and the smell of gunpowder between them made the world reduce itself to two breathing things stitched together by accident and intent. In the small, ragged light of dawn that would come later, men in town would debate who had been right and who had been foolish. For now, as Samuel leaned against the fence and the night leaked away, he looked at the woman who had taken his rifle and turned it into salvation and felt the sharpness of something like love, unnamed, hesitant, and dangerous, rise up inside him, braided tightly with the knowledge that her bullets had bought them both a few more mornings, and that whatever came next would have to be faced together. At sunrise the ranch was a steady and pale golden shadow, light sliding across the scorched earth and finding the ragged edges of last night's violence, and Samuel stood on the porch with a bandage kneaded his shoulder, face washed the color of bone and eyes sharp with wakefulness, while Nieli leaned against the doorway as if the house itself had learned she belonged there. The world felt both very small and very wide, small in the sense that only two breaths seemed to matter right then, wide in the way the horizon held all the possibilities that could be born from a single refusal to follow the old rules. He watched her fingers, saw how they curled around the wood of the railing with a tenderness that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the habit of holding on. And he thought of the night before when her rifle had spoken for both of them and carved a pause in the valley's appetite for blood. "You could have left me to die," he said quietly, his voice not a demand but the honest accounting of a man who had been made vulnerable in sign and dark alike. There was no theatrics in it, no claim to martyrdom, just the raw arithmetic of debt and salvation. She met his gaze with a steadiness that was both deflection and answer. "So could you," she replied, and the words landed like two simple facts colliding, true enough to break something and true enough to build something from the ruins. The exchange between them had the hush of a prayer that neither prayed, a private liturgy spoken without a church, and something sacred, small and dangerous and wholly human, passed between them in that quiet, something older than law and purer than the town's judgments. Samuel felt the house around him. The picture of his late wife above the hearth, the faint scent that clung to the curtains, bent toward this new arrangement, as if memory itself were trying to accommodate what the present had insisted upon. He reached for her hand then, an awkward, adult gesture that carried more meaning than words could hold, and when their fingers touched, it was like two ropes being knotted together in a storm, practical, necessary, and binding. He swallowed. The bandage at his shoulder rustled as he moved. "Stay with me," he said, quieter still, almost afraid that sound would topple the fragile truce of dawn, not his death, but his wife. There was no flourish, no lawyer's phrasing, only the plain offering of a life shared, the kind of vow made in small moments rather than at a pulpit. She did not answer with an immediate yes. Such promises in the frontier carried weight enough to drown a person, and she had been taught by fire and loss to be careful. Instead, she watched him for a long breath, the sun catching at the dark rims of her eyes, and then she took his hand without a word, the action both consent and covenant, and in that silence the house seemed to breathe out, an old grief and a new possibility folding into one. Around them, the day woke. A dog barked distantly, a wagon creaked on the road, and somewhere in town a shutter opened as if to check on the rumor of their lives. But none of it could touch what had settled between Samuel and Neely on that porch. He felt the shape of the choice like a tide. No maps would tell them how to navigate the coming days. No law would bless them, and the preacher might withhold his blessing. Yet there was an intimacy in deciding together that made rules seem smaller. In the corners of his mind he heard the town's whispers, the ledger of grudges that would count his act as a debt against his name. But those sounds were distant, like thunder miles away. What mattered now was the warmth of her hand in his and the promise implied by the quiet class, to share chores, to mend fences, to wake to one another and to the work of living when life offered neither romance nor ease but instead the steady practice of care. Neely's face softened marginally, not with subservience but with the clear-eyed acceptance of someone who names a thing by its truth. She was not his possession. He was not her savior. They were two people choosing a shared vulnerability, and that recognition was its own kind of vow. Samuel lifted his bandaged arm and let his fingers lace with hers, an unadorned union under the open sky, and for the first time since the fever took his wife he felt the edges of his grief align with a new purpose. The town would shout, the men who spat his name would plan, and dangers would come as sure as seasons. But on that porch at sunrise, with dust settling in the eaves and the ghosts watching from frames in memory, something like peace took root, two lives, scarred and stubborn, choosing to stand together, and a quiet, dangerous hope that the frontier might, slowly, be remade not by law or blood but by simple, enduring loyalty. When they married, the town erupted with the kind of small, furious theater that passes for justice in places where everyone has practiced outrage for generations. The shutters came down a notch, women clucked behind hands, the saloon hummed with bets and barleyed voices, and the preacher who had officiated at every respectable union in the valley looked at Samuel and Neely as if the sight burned him and refused to lay a blessing on them. His refusal was not a private sorrow but a public performance, a white-gloved punctuation to the town's displeasure. And when an insult about mercy and miscegenation was spat into the street like something already chewed, Samuel answered with the rawest currency he had left, a single, clean punch that knocked the man back into his own ugliness and shut his mouth as effectively as any lock could have. And the sound of that fall, less dramatic than a duel and more decisive than any sermon, seemed to change the tenor of the day because it demonstrated that Samuel would not be reduced to a proverb. The ceremony itself was small, no lavish feast, no choir, only the thin varnish of sunlight on the porch and a few honest faces who came despite the gossip. But it was exact in meaning, a decision made in plain terms by two people who had traded bitterness for a precarious, deliberate tenderness. For weeks afterwards, the town performed its ritual of disdain. The fingers of rumor pointed, the ledger of grudges was consulted, and men at the feed store would weigh and measure what Samuel had given up, as if mercy could be quantified and scored. Yet over time the noise dulled, not because principle had changed but because life persisted in its own stubborn way. Horses birthed foals, rains came, the spring that had once been lean bloomed a different green across Samuel's fields, and the work, mending fences, coaxing water, planting seed, demanded time and attention that gossip could not fill. The ranch, which had known no hollow of last winter's burned rafters and the hollow of nights where only memory kept the house warm, began to breathe again. Shoots knuckle their way through the dirt like small truths insisting on daylight, and the patch of land nearest the porch grew surprisingly lush as if the ground itself approved of the quiet covenant the two had struck. People softened at the edges because the world allows softening when it must choose between spectacle and the steady, inconvenient truth of neighbors who do their work. Neighbors started to borrow tools without the furtive calculation that had marked seasons before. Children who once mimicked curses in alleys now waved with the awkward eagerness of youth discovering new grammar, and even the preacher, stubborn, fearful, human, found himself seeing them in the light at chore's end, Nayeli carrying water with the same unshowy dignity he admired in the widow Morrow, Samuel offering a hand without grandiloquence, and the silence he had made at their wedding became something like an apology later, expressed in small kindnesses rather than pronouncements. The ledger of the town did not disappear. Old men still held the memory of that first sale at the sheriff's table as a thing to scold the next generation with. But the daily logic of living proved more persuasive than the loudest moralizing. Bread must be baked, wounds must be dressed, fences must be mended, and in those acts Samuel and Nayeli built a life that was not ostentatious but resilient. Love, in the way the land teaches it, is rarely the thunderous end of a tale. It is the slow, stubborn rooting of ordinary acts, setting an extra plate without mention, carrying a blanket to the barn at midnight, learning a way to plait a rope so it does not chafe a cold. The anger faded not because men renounced their past, but because the evidence of this marriage's quiet utility outweighed their need for drama. Coughs of approval replaced curses, and whispers dwindled into acceptance that had the shape of civility more than celebration. Seasons turned. Their first child came with the pale hush of dawn, enjoyed a new vulnerability that made even the loudest critics look away, and the ranch grew green as if brushed anew by a hand who preferred cultivation to conquest. In the end, what the town remembered was not the scandal but the stubborn fact that life had resumed, less spectacular, more honest, and the story of Samuel and Nayeli settled into the valley like a new stone in a long pathway. It was neither wholly forgiven nor wholly vilified, but it endured, an emblem of a different courage that asks less for glory and more for the daily work of surviving together. Years later, the ranch settled into a quiet that felt less like absence and more like a careful breathing. Mesquite casting a web of shade over the porch where Samuel now sat with hair gone silver at the temples and the deep lines of a life etched into his face, watching children run through the grass with the slow and astonished delight of the young who have never had to measure love against rumor. The world around him had grown softer at the edges, not because cruelty had been erased but because the daily insistence of living together had worn it down. And Nayeli moved among those small lives with the same sure hands she once used to tend colts and pry a jam-stalled door open against flame, humming a song in her native tongue that rode the wind like a thread through the valley, a melody at once foreign and homely, filling the spaces the town's gossip once occupied. The children, brown-haired, sun-splashed, a tangle of laughter and scrape-kneed adventures, ran in arcs around the fence, sometimes tumbling into one another the way only children do, and Samuel watched with a mixture of awe and a kind of soft fear, the same terror a man feels when he knows the sacredness of what he has been given. His hand found Nayeli's without looking, the fingers fitting as if they had been mended to one another by habit and by the hard arithmetic of choice. And when she glanced his way, the smile that touched her mouth was spare but bright, as if gratitude and stubbornness had combined into a single steady light. In the years since the sale and the fires and the nights when torches burned at the ridge, the ranch had reclaimed itself. Fields once thin and brittle swallowed seed and pushed green into furrows. Horses grew fat again on safe pasture, and barns were rebuilt with hands that knew better than to trust stranger kindness. The town's anger, which once roared like a winter gale, diminished into a hum, backgrounded by the banal needs of neighbors who still required one another through drought and cold. Memory worked in strange ways. Some mornings Samuel woke with the acute ache of old grief like a brand, feeling the echo of his late wife's slap and the phantom weight of the child he had once expected, while other days the house filled with new sounds, small voices learning both English and the syllables of Nayeli's songs, a patchwork of tongues braided in the kitchen around a stew pot. Nayeli would hum as she did chores, a low ribbon of melody that braided with the mesquite's whisper, and sometimes Samuel would catch himself remembering the first time he had looked into her eyes across the desert and felt a fissure open, then a thing reckless and lonely. Now the fissure had become a doorway through which the rest of his life had walked. There were still debts to reckon with, a neighbor's grudge that took a slow generation to unwind, the occasional glare from a man who could not see past his own shame. But those were small, human irritants beside the larger truth. Mercy had not been a weakness that ended him, but a choice that planted a stubborn garden in the dust. He thought often of the nights when the Yelly had sung for the dead, when the two of them had shared firelight and confessions and learned to carry other people's sorrow as if it were a necessary load rather than a sentence. Those shared nights became anchors for a life that, if not easy, was honest. Children grew, and with them grew the acceptance that had once been absent. Their laughter made the town's whispers seem mean and small, and people who once chauffeured past Samuel in the market now tipped a nod or asked after his family's health. The wind moved across the valley as if telling an old story, one that remembered both cruelty and tenderness, with each gust carrying notes of a Yelly song that tangled in the mesquite's leaves and rode toward the hills. Samuel closed his eyes and let the sound gather his memory. The sheriff's smirk, the burnt barn, the bullet in his shoulder, the nights of pleading and the mornings of quiet work, all braided into a single life more whole for being imperfect. When he opened his eyes and watched his children chase one another beneath the forgiving sky, he felt the fierce, ridiculous joy that comes when one realizes a dangerous thing has been done. Something small and brave enough to be called love, and in the hush that followed the laughter the valley seemed to agree, the wind slipping through the grasses like a voice that had long remembered. Mercy, he understood at last, was not the opposite of courage but its necessary cousin. It had not killed him but had saved them both, and the memory of the truth moved across the desert in quiet breaths as Niyeli's song rose and fell. The children's feet drummed the earth in a rhythm of life, and Samuel sat beneath the mesquite with his fingers in hers, the world around them a soft, tremulous promise that even a frontier born of violence could learn, slowly, how to shelter what mattered most. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.